I never thought helping a woman load bags of mulch into her trunk would be what kept me from losing everything. But when she grabbed my sleeve in the parking lot of Hendrick's Hardware and whispered those 12 words, something in the way she said them made the back of my neck go cold. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, I want to say, drop your city or state in the comments. It means a lot to know where this reaches. And a quick note, this story blends real experience with some fictionalized details for privacy. But the lessons about family, trust, and what betrayal really looks like, those are as true as anything I've ever known. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning that smells like wood smoke and wet leaves and reminds you that the good days are nearly behind you for the year. I'd been awake since 5, same as always. Old habit from 38 years of carpentry, when the light told you how many hours you had left to work. My wife Carol used to joke that I ran on sawdust and stubbornness. She wasn't wrong. She'd been gone 2 years by then, taken by a heart attack that moved fast and left no room for goodbyes. I still reached for her side of the bed some mornings, before the quiet reminded me. The house sat on 3 acres at the edge of Mill Haven, Ohio, a small town about 40 minutes south of Columbus where everybody still knew your last name. Carol and I had bought the place 30 years ago when the kids were young. Nothing fancy, a ranch style with a covered porch, a detached garage I'd converted into a workshop, and enough yard that a man could breathe. After I retired, I'd put more hours into that workshop than I ever had on paying jobs. Built furniture for neighbors, repaired things people brought me, taught a couple of teenagers how to use a lathe, kept my hands busy, kept my mind from going to dark places. My older son lived out in Seattle with his wife and kids. We talked on Sundays, nothing more than that. He'd moved west right after college, and the distance had settled into something permanent over the years. Not unfriendly, just distant. My younger son was different. He'd stayed closer, lived in Columbus, worked in finance. He called often, stopped by on weekends. After Carol passed, he'd been the one organizing things, the estate paperwork, the insurance claims, the whole overwhelming machinery of losing a spouse. I was grateful. He was good at those things in a way I never was. I trusted him with it completely. Looking back, that trust was exactly what he was counting on. I'd driven into town that Tuesday morning to pick up sandpaper and a new set of chisels. Simple errand. The hardware store had been on this block since 1971, run by the same family, and it still smelled like motor oil and pine resin the moment you walked in. I was loading my truck in the parking lot when I noticed the woman at the car next to mine. She was in her early 70s. Trim, silver hair pulled back neatly, struggling to lift a 50-pound bag of mulch from a flatbed cart into her trunk. She had 2 more bags waiting on the cart. I didn't think about it. I just walked over. "Let me get that for you," I said. She looked up, startled. "Oh, I don't want to trouble you. It's no trouble at all." I lifted the first bag in, then the second, then the third. She thanked me twice, insisted it was too kind of me, the kind of back and forth you do when a stranger does something small and decent. I was already halfway back to my truck when she called after me. "Sir." I turned. She was standing very still beside her car, both hands on the edge of the trunk. Her expression had changed. Whatever warmth had been in it a moment ago was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. Serious. Careful. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. "But I know who you are. You're Harold Kowalski. You live on the Birch Creek Road property." I stopped. "That's right." She looked around the parking lot once, then took 2 steps toward me and lowered her voice. "Don't let your son take you to any attorney's office next week. And do not sign anything he puts in front of you. Not until you've had someone you choose look at it first." I stared at her. "Excuse me? I'm sorry. I know how this sounds." Her eyes were steady, gray-green, sharp. I couldn't see you in that parking lot and not say something. Please, be careful." She turned back to her car, closed the trunk, and got in. I stood there for a long moment holding my keys. A stranger had just walked up and warned me about my own son. My first instinct was to dismiss it as the strange ramblings of someone confused, maybe mixing me up with someone else. But she'd known my name, she'd known my address, and she'd specifically said next week. as if she knew a timeline, as if she knew a plan. My son had called me just 3 days earlier. He'd mentioned he'd set up a meeting with an estate planning attorney in Columbus, someone he trusted. Said it was time to get things in order, put together a proper trust so the property would transfer cleanly when the time came. He'd framed it as looking out for me, said I shouldn't have to worry about these things. I'd told him I'd think about it, and he'd said, "Wednesday works well. I'll pick you up at 10. I drove home slowly. The workshop was quiet when I got back. I stood at my bench for a while without picking anything up, just thinking. Carol used to say I was a man who needed to hold a problem in his hands before I could understand it. The same way I needed to hold a piece of wood and feel the grain before I knew how to work it. She was right about that too. What did I actually know? A stranger in a parking lot had warned me not to sign legal documents my son was arranging. That was all. It could be nothing. My son could be genuinely trying to help me with estate planning, exactly as he'd said. The woman could be confused or even unwell, but she'd known my name and my address and the word next week. I walked across the yard to the detached garage. I used the front half as a workshop and kept the back half for storage. Carol's old Honda, that I couldn't bring myself to sell, and a set of metal filing cabinets where I kept the important papers. Deed to the property. Carol's life insurance settlement documents. Our joint investment account records. The original copy of Carol's will. I hadn't opened those cabinets in months. The first thing I noticed was the lock on the second cabinet. I used a simple keyed padlock, the kind you buy at any hardware store. I'd had it for years, but there were fresh scratches around the keyhole, bright silver against the old brass, the kind of marks that come from someone using the wrong key and trying to make it work. Not old scratches. New ones. I stood very still for a moment, then went and got my key from the hook by the workbench. The cabinet opened, and at first, everything looked the same. The hanging folders in their usual order, labeled in my handwriting. But when I pulled out the one marked property deed, the paper inside didn't feel right. Too crisp, too white. I set it on the workbench under the light and looked carefully. It was a photocopy. A good one, but a photocopy. The original had a coffee ring on the bottom right corner from the day I'd spread papers across the kitchen table the first week we owned the house. Carol had set her mug down without thinking, and we'd both laughed about it. That ring wasn't here. I went through the rest of the folder. The original deed was gone. The original insurance settlement letter was gone, replaced by another clean copy. And at the back of the cabinet, in a folder I didn't recognize, was a document I had never seen. It was a trust agreement, 8 pages long, transferring control of my property and remaining assets to something called the Kowalski Family Trust. The trustee named was my son. The grantor signature line had my name printed beneath it, and above the line, in a hand that was close to mine but not mine, was a signature. My hands were shaking when I set it down. I went inside and poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table where Carol and I had eaten every meal for 30 years. The same table where I'd helped my sons with homework, where we'd opened Christmas cards, where I'd sat alone in the dark for 3 weeks after the funeral, unable to eat. Someone had been in my garage. Someone had taken my original documents and replaced them with copies, clean and unverifiable. Someone had planted a forged trust document with my signature on it. And whoever had done this was planning to take me to an attorney on Wednesday to sign something, presumably the same document or one like it. And if I signed it, control of everything I owned would pass to my son. I thought about the 6 months since Carol passed, all the things he'd helped me handle. He'd had access to the house during the estate process. I'd given him a key without thinking twice, because he was my son, because he was helping, because I was grieving, and I needed someone to handle things I couldn't face. He'd had weeks in this house without me watching, long enough to have a key to that filing cabinet copied, long enough to swap out documents at his leisure. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I drove back into town. I stopped at the title and abstract company on the main square, a small office I'd visited once when Carol and I refinanced years ago. I asked the woman at the front desk if I could speak with someone about a property matter. The woman who came out to meet me was the woman from the hardware store parking lot. We stared at each other. Then she said, quietly, "Come on back." Her name was Vera Hutchins. She'd been a paralegal for 22 years before retiring and coming to work part-time at the title company for something to do. She knew property documents the way I knew wood grain, by feel, by instinct, by years of handling them. She told me what she knew. My son and a man named Greg Sattler, a developer based in Columbus who had been quietly buying up parcels along the Route 33 corridor in anticipation of a planned interchange, had come into her office 6 weeks ago, requesting a title search on my property. She'd processed the request professionally, but she'd overheard my son on his phone in the waiting room saying he had the appointment set for Dad to sign Wednesday and that once the trust was established, they could move on the sale. She hadn't known exactly what that meant, but it had troubled her. Then she'd seen me in the parking lot and recognized me from the property paperwork. "I couldn't prove anything," she said. "I still can't, but I couldn't do nothing either." I put the forged trust document on her desk. She put on her reading glasses and studied it for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up. "This signature is forged," she said. "I've seen enough to know, and this trust structure, it gives him full discretionary authority. He could sell your property without consulting you once this was filed. How much is that land worth to a developer?" She hesitated. "The Sattler Group paid $2.1 million for the Hendricks parcel last spring. Your 3 acres are comparable." I sat with that for a moment. My son had been willing to destroy me for roughly $2 million. Vera leaned forward. "Harold, there's something else you need to know." She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. "After I warned you yesterday, I pulled everything we had on this transaction. The title search your son requested, it came with a supporting affidavit claiming power of attorney, signed by you, dated 8 weeks ago. I had never signed a power of attorney. He's been building this for months," she said. I drove directly to the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Dennis Rourke had been in office for 12 years. He was a methodical man, the kind who listened without interrupting, and wrote things down in a small spiral notebook rather than a tablet. He listened to everything I told him, looked at the documents I'd brought, and asked 4 or 5 questions that were direct and specific. He didn't offer sympathy or outrage. He just wrote. When I finished, he set down his pen. "The forged power of attorney alone is a felony," he said. "Combine it with the trust document and the title research, and you're looking at a conspiracy charge. If Sattler is involved, this goes federal wire fraud, elder financial abuse. How long? We'll need to move carefully. Get a forensic examiner on the signature. Pull phone records and communications between your son and Sattler. Probably 2 to 3 weeks for a solid case." He looked at me steadily. "Don't tip him off. Keep the Wednesday appointment on the calendar. Let him think." Everything is proceeding normally. That was the hardest part. I drove home and sat on my porch in the cold October air and thought about my son at 39 years old, sharp and confident, the kind of man who walked into rooms and knew which conversations to have with which people. I thought about the days after Carol's funeral when he'd sat at my kitchen table going through paperwork with me, and I'd been too gutted with grief to read anything carefully, just signed where he pointed and trusted that he was handling things. I thought about every Sunday call in the past 2 years, every visit, every time he'd asked how I was doing and I'd said fine because that was what men my age said. I thought about whether any of it had been real. He called Wednesday morning at 9 to confirm he'd pick me up at 10. I told him I was looking forward to it. My voice came out steady. I surprised myself. "Great, Dad. This is going to be a real weight off your shoulders." "I know," I said. "I'll be ready." When he pulled up at 10, I was on the porch. I climbed in and made conversation about the weather the whole drive to Columbus. He seemed relaxed, cheerful. He took me to a glass and chrome office building downtown and introduced me to an attorney I'd never met, a young man in a good suit who shook my hand warmly and called me by my first name. The document sitting on the conference room table was a trust agreement, 8 pages. I recognized the structure from the forged copy I'd found in my garage. "Take your time looking it over," the attorney said. I looked it over. I said I appreciated him walking me through it. I said the language was a little complex for me, and I'd like to have my own attorney review it before signing, someone I'd been working with for years. I watched my son's face. He kept smiling, but something shifted behind his eyes. A tightening, just for a moment. "Of course," he said easily. "No rush. Whatever makes you comfortable, Dad." On the drive home, he talked about Thanksgiving plans and whether I'd thought about getting a new water heater before winter. Normal conversation. I listened and responded and looked out the window at the highway and thought about how a person could sit next to someone they'd known their whole life and understand in that moment that they didn't really know them at all. The investigation moved forward. Sheriff Rourke was thorough and quiet. His forensic document examiner confirmed within a week that the signatures on both the power of attorney and the trust agreement were forged. Subpoenas went out for financial records and communications. What came back was more than I'd expected. Emails between my son and Sattler going back 14 months, long before Carol had even died, discussing the property's development potential. Messages about timing, about waiting for the right moment, about getting the paperwork in place. In one exchange, my son had written that the old man won't put up a fight once the trust is filed. He's never been sharp with legal stuff. He trusts me. There was a text message to Sattler that simply read, "It's basically already ours." My own son, the boy I'd taught to use a hand plane at age 10, the one Carol had worried about because he was too charming, too comfortable in rooms where decisions were made with other people's money. She'd said it with love, the way mothers do. I'd told her she was being too hard on him. She'd been right about that, too. The arrests came on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after I'd walked into the sheriff's office. My son and Greg Sattler both. The charges were conspiracy to commit fraud, elder financial abuse, forgery of legal documents, and filing false instruments with the county. Sattler's attorney made noise about the whole thing being a misunderstanding, a preliminary business conversation taken out of context. The physical evidence did not support his attorney's position. My son did not call me. Not that day. Not the week after. A few days after the arrests, I drove to the title company to see Vera. I brought her a small cactus from the garden center, the kind Carol used to keep on the kitchen windowsill because she said they were honest plants that didn't need much from you. We sat in her small office with the door closed and 2 cups of coffee between us. "I've been doing this work for a long time," she said, holding her mug with both hands. 30 years of handling property documents for people. I've seen a lot of families make mistakes, cut corners, trust the wrong person with the details. But what your son was doing, it was deliberate, calculated. That's different. How long do you think he was planning it? Based on what you've told me about the communications? He was thinking about this before your wife passed. She paused. "I'm sorry, Harold. That's a hard thing to sit with." It was. The idea that even during Carol's illness, during those last hard months, there had been part of my son's mind running calculations about what would happen to the property. I couldn't fully absorb it. Maybe I never would. "Why didn't you go directly to the police?" I asked. "When you overheard him that day." She was quiet for a moment. "I had no proof. Just a phone conversation I half heard in a waiting room. Your son is charming and well-dressed and speaks like someone whose word carries weight. I'm a 71-year-old woman working part-time at a title office because I got bored at home. Who do you think they'd have believed?" She looked at me evenly. "I needed you to find the evidence yourself. I just needed to make sure you knew to look. There was more to it than that. I learned it later, from Sheriff Rourke. Vera had handled Carol's estate filing 2 years ago, the paperwork that came through her office after the will was probated. She'd noticed a small discrepancy in how the investment account transfer had been filed, a detail that hadn't seemed important enough to flag at the time, but that she'd thought about since. Warning me was partly about me, and partly about the things she felt she should have caught earlier. She never said that directly, but I understood it. Some deaths aren't about money. I drove to the prison to see my son 4 months later, on a Tuesday in late February. After the sentencing, he'd gotten 7 years. Sattler got 9. The forged documents and the recorded communications had left their attorneys very little to work with. He looked smaller than I expected, thinner. The easy confidence he'd always worn had gone somewhere. He sat across from me at the table and didn't say anything for a long time. "I need to understand," I said. "Not for a judge, Not for anyone else. For me. Help me understand. He looked at his hands. The property was worth a lot of money, Dad. I know what it was worth. And it was just sitting there. You were never going to sell it. You were going to die on it and leave it to Danny and me, and half of it would go to someone who barely calls you. Someone who walked away from this family when it was convenient and then gets to inherit the same as me. He looked up, and what I saw in his face wasn't remorse. It was an old resentment, smooth and settled, like it had been living there for years. I did all the work. After Mom died, I handled everything. And for what? An equal share with someone who wasn't even here? You could have talked to me. You would have said it was fine, that Danny deserved the same. You always said that. Because he does. He shook his head slowly, as if I'd said something that proved a point he'd been making to himself for a long time. I stood to go. I forgive you, I said. Not because what you did is forgivable. Because I've lived long enough to know that carrying hatred is its own kind of prison. I don't want it. I picked up my jacket. But I won't be back here. He didn't answer. I walked out into the gray February sky and stood beside my truck for a moment, just breathing the cold air. A pair of sparrows were squabbling on a fence post nearby over something invisible to me. The ordinary world. Carrying on. My older son flew in from Seattle the following month. He'd called when the arrests were reported and had stayed in close touch since. He wasn't the same as he'd been when we were all younger. Neither was I. But we sat on the porch 2 evenings in a row and talked in the way that men sometimes manage when enough time and enough loss have taken the pride out of a conversation. He asked what I planned to do with the property. I'd been thinking about that since October, about who I was and what I'd built and what I wanted it to mean when I was gone. Carol and I had never been wealthy people. We'd been people who worked and built and taught things with our hands. I'd spent 30 years making things out of wood. I'd taught apprentices who'd gone on to run their own shops. That was the real inheritance, not the acreage, not the assessed value on some county tax document, but the knowledge of how to make something that would outlast you. I'd already spoken to the vocational school in town. The director had nearly cried. 3 acres with a working shop, left to a program that taught woodworking and trades to kids who needed a direction. It would be their permanent campus. There would be a small plaque with Carol's name on it. And mine. And that was enough. My son heard me out and nodded slowly. He looked out over the yard, at the workshop and the bare November trees and the sky that was starting to go orange at the edge. Mom would have loved that, he said. I know. Vera Hutchins has become a regular presence in my life since then. She comes by the workshop on Saturday mornings sometimes and drinks coffee while I work. She doesn't say much, which suits both of us. She brought me tomato seedlings in spring, and I built her a small window bench in exchange. The kind of friendship that happens between people who've been through something real together and don't need to keep explaining it. Some mornings I walk out to the garage and stand at those filing cabinets for a moment before starting work. The originals are all back now, retrieved from wherever my son had stored them, returned as part of the evidence process. The deed with the coffee ring is back in its folder. Carol's ring, faint as a ghost on the bottom right corner. If you've listened this far, I want to say one thing. Elder financial abuse is one of the most common crimes in this country and one of the least talked about. It happens inside families, behind the language of help and care and looking out for you. It happened to me, and I'd spent a lifetime thinking I was too careful, too grounded, too smart for it. I wasn't any of those things when I was grieving. None of us are. Pay attention to the people who warn you, even when they're strangers. Sometimes the person most willing to tell you the truth is the one who has nothing to gain from the telling. And if someone you've never met stops you in a parking lot with a warning that doesn't make immediate sense, take it home with you. Turn it over in your hands like a piece of wood you don't recognize yet. Because sometimes the grain only reveals itself when you look at it in the right light. That's my story. Drop your city or state in the comments below. Tell me if this reached you. And if you're watching over someone you love, please share this with them. You never know who needs to hear it.